Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. In a historic judgment, the Supreme Court has ruled that daughters have equal right to inherit property, and through this ruling, it has clarified the confusion surrounding the Hindu Succession Act. So in order to understand this article, first we need to talk about the Hindu Succession Act of 1956. See, the Hindu Succession Act of 1956 codified the Mitakshara school of Hindu law, which provides for succession and inheritance of ancestral property. See, under the Mitakshara school of Hindu law, in a Hindu undivided family, that is in a Hindu joint family, only the male child has been recognized as the legal heir to the ancestral property, whereas the female siblings of the male child have no claim. And this discriminatory law of succession and inheritance found in the Mitakshara school of Hindu law was codified into the Hindu Succession Act of 1956. This law applies for Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, and as well as to the followers of Arya Samaj and Brahmo Samaj. This discriminatory provision against the female child is an extension of the orthodox patriarchal rules found in religious laws. But even though the Hindu Succession Act does not apply for Muslims, Christians, Parsis and Jews, such discriminatory patriarchal laws of succession and inheritance can be found in other religions as well, but in a different form and in a different variation. For example, in Islam, there is no distinction created between the female child and the male child when it comes to succession and inheritance. Both the male and the female child are recognized as legal heirs to ancestral property. But in practice, the female child is given only half of the share as compared to the male child. So on similar lines, the laws of succession and inheritance found in the Mitakshara school of Hindu law that was codified into the Hindu Succession Act of 1956 was seen to be discriminatory in nature for the female child, and it was seen to be violative of fundamental rights guaranteed under Article 14, Article 15 and Article 21. So in order to address this discriminatory nature of the Hindu Succession Act, the law was amended in 2005, and under Section 6 of the Hindu Succession Amendment Act of 2005, the daughter was also recognized as a co-partner, and her equal right to ancestral property was recognized by birth. In legal terminology, co-partner basically refers to equal birthright to ancestral property. This amendment introduced to the Hindu Succession Act was in line with the recommendations of the 174th Law Commission, and it was designed to address the gender-based discrimination with regard to succession and inheritance of ancestral property. But this gender-based discrimination did not end even after the introduction of this amendment in 2005 because of the confusion surrounding the interpretation of Section 6 of the Hindu Succession Act of 2005. The confusion was over the retrospective application of Section 6. See, the amended act came into effect from the 9th of September 2005. So it was not clear whether the amended provisions of Section 6 would be applicable from the 9th of September 2005 onwards, or would it have retrospective application? That is, would the amended provisions apply for previous cases as well? That is, before the Amendment Act came into effect. So while interpreting this confusion of Section 6 of the Amended Act, the Supreme Court and the High Courts took differing views in multiple cases. In a 2015 case, the Supreme Court had declared that the amended provisions of Section 6 would apply only if both the daughter and the father are living as of 9th of September 2005. So basically, this ruling of the Supreme Court did not recognize the retrospective application of the law, and with regard to cases arising before the 9th of September 2005, gender-based discrimination continued under the Hindu Succession Act. Then in a 2018 case, the Supreme Court had ruled that Section 6 of the Hindu Succession Amendment Act of 2005 applies retrospectively. So now a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court was looking at a similar case, and it was expected to clarify the confusion surrounding the interpretation of Section 6 of the Hindu Succession Amendment Act. So through the latest judgment, the Supreme Court has clarified its position, and it has settled the confusion surrounding the interpretation of Section 6. The Supreme Court has ruled that daughters have equal right to inherit property and this position applies retrospectively. Because the Supreme Court has observed that the purpose of introducing this amendment in 2005 was to put an end to gender-based discrimination with regard to succession and inheritance of ancestral property. So the Supreme Court has held that by denying retrospective application, we would be allowing gender-based discrimination to continue in case of inheritance claims that existed prior to the 9th of September 2005. So in this context, the Supreme Court has made a historical observation, and it has said that a daughter always remains a loving daughter, whereas a son is a son until he gets a wife. Justice Arun Mishra, who headed the three-judge bench of the Supreme Court, has said that a daughter remains a daughter throughout her life, and hence she has equal birth rights, that is co-partner rights, to ancestral property. And the Supreme Court has held that this right applies retrospectively, irrespective of the fact whether the father was alive or dead prior to 2005. Then a related article on page number 15 points out that this landmark ruling of the Supreme Court serves as a wake-up call to family businesses, especially traditional family businesses, that have failed to recognize the daughter's equal rights to a share in the family's ancestral property. See, after the 2005 amendment was introduced to the Hindu Succession Act, a number of business families had accommodated the rights of the daughters with regard to their shareholding in the family business. But a number of traditional family businesses had refused to recognize this right, so the latest ruling of the Supreme Court serves as a wake-up call to them. Now let's take up an article from page number 4, which deals with Clause 6 of the Assam Accord. But to understand this, first we need to look at the background to the Assam Accord. See, over the years, the state of Assam has received a huge influx of refugees and illegal migrants from neighboring East Pakistan and Bangladesh. Following the partition of 1947, there was a huge influx of refugees from East Pakistan into Assam. Then later, in the late 1960s, the atrocities committed by the Pakistani army in East Pakistan against Bengali minorities pushed a number of refugees into India between 1961 and 1971. Then after East Pakistan was liberated with India's assistance, and after Bangladesh was established as an independent country in 1971, there has been a constant inflow of illegal migrants across the border into Assam. So this large-scale entry of illegal foreigners into Assam has always been opposed by the native Assamese, because the natives feel that the illegal foreigners pose a threat to their unique culture, their language, their faith, their political rights, their opportunities, and to their resources. So this opposition by the native Assamese against the large-scale entry of illegal foreigners from East Pakistan and from Bangladesh has led to socio-ethnic tensions and even communal violence and concerns surrounding the impact of this demographic change held by the native Assamese led to the Assam movement or the Assam agitation that lasted for 6 years. The Assam agitation was primarily led by students and student organizations such as the All Assam Students Union, and the agitation lasted between 1979 and 1985. This movement in Assam also laid the foundation for insurgency in the state, and it led to the establishment of several insurgent outfits such as the Ulfa in 1979. Following these violent protests and insurgency, the government of India finally began negotiating with the protesters, and this resulted in the signing of the Assam Accord in 1985. So through the Assam Accord, the government of India made a few commitments to the protesters, and as per the accord, the government committed to prevent illegal migration from Bangladesh and secure India's international border with Bangladesh by erecting physical barriers. Under the Assam Accord, the government also recognized a citizenship cutoff date, and the 24th of March 1971 was selected as the cutoff date in order to identify the genuine Indian citizens in the state of Assam and distinguish them from illegal foreigners. So this citizenship cutoff date would also become the basis for updating the National Register of Citizens or the NRC. Under the Assam Accord, the government promised to update the NRC again, which was last updated in 1951, in order to distinguish between genuine Indian citizens and illegal foreigners based on this citizenship cutoff date. So as per this promised NRC exercise, those who could prove that they had resided in the state of Assam prior to this cutoff date, they would be provided with Indian citizenship, and the others would be recognized as illegal foreigners. This promised NRC exercise was not held for nearly 3 decades, and it was taken up by the government only after the recent intervention of the Supreme Court. Last year, the NRC exercise was completed and the final list was also published as per the directions of the Supreme Court. And this is a topic that we have covered numerous times over the last 1 year. Under the final list of the NRC, around 4 million people have been left out and they face the risk of being declared as illegal foreigners. Then under the Assam Accord, we have Clause 6, under which the government had committed to provide for constitutional, legislative and administrative safeguards in order to protect and promote the cultural, social and linguistic heritage of the native Assamese people. As per this commitment, the government was supposed to provide for special constitutional, legislative and administrative measures which could protect the interests of the indigenous people. This was supposed to include the provision of reservation for the native Assamese with regard to seats in the state assembly, in local bodies and as well as with regard to government jobs. It was also supposed to provide for special constitutional, legislative and administrative measures in order to protect the cultural and linguistic heritage of the native Assamese. So in order to implement these commitments under Clause 6 of the Assam Accord, the Government of India was supposed to set up an expert committee. But the implementation of Clause 6 had been delayed for a number of decades and the final trigger came with the enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Act in 2019. See, we know that the Citizenship Amendment Act proposes to provide for Indian citizenship to religious minorities, that is except for Muslims who might have faced religious persecution in 3 countries, that is in Afghanistan, in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. So as a result of this provision of the Citizenship Amendment Act, Hindus, Buddhists, even Sikhs, Jains and possibly Christians and Parsis who might have entered India from Bangladesh as illegal migrants will end up getting Indian citizenship. See, as we discussed earlier, the opposition of the native Assamese was against all illegal foreigners from Bangladesh and East Pakistan. Their opposition was not on religious lines. They were equally opposed to a Hindu illegal migrant and as well as to a Muslim illegal migrant. But the Citizenship Amendment Act of India creates a distinction between these illegal migrants, and hence the Citizenship Amendment Act had triggered massive protests in Assam last year because its provisions go against the commitments made under the Assam Accord. So in order to pacify these protesters, the Ministry of Home Affairs decided to set up a committee headed by retired Judge Biplab Kumar Sharma, and as per the given terms of reference, the Biplab Kumar Sharma committee submitted a confidential report to the government which was supposed to give effect to the commitments of the Government of India made under Clause 6 of the Assam Accord. Basically, the Biplab Kumar Sharma committee gave recommendations for providing reservation and other provisions which could provide for constitutional, legislative and administrative safeguards to the native Assamese. But according to this article on page number 4, it has been nearly 6 months that the committee submitted the report, but unfortunately the government is yet to act on it. So as a result, a few members of the Biplab Kumar Sharma committee were frustrated with government's inaction and they have decided to make public their recommendations which were a part of the confidential report. Now let's take up a column from page number 6 written by Rajiv Bhargava. In this column, the writer evaluates the future of Indian secularism, that is constitutional secularism. See, of late, there have been several developments in the Indian society which has led few critics and experts to conclude that the constitutional principle of secularism is lying on the deathbed. But the writer argues that it is premature to pronounce the end of constitutional secularism, and he substantiates his argument by explaining the principle of constitutional secularism in India. See, the writer brings out the differences that exist in the principle of secularism when you compare the Indian constitution with Western constitutions. The writer says that the Western principle of secularism is anti-religious, meaning it creates a clear distinction between the church and the state. Whereas the concept of constitutional secularism adopted in the Indian constitution promotes critical respect for all religions. See, in Western constitutions, the principle of secularism has a negative connotation because it creates a clear distinction between the church and the state, and it mandates the state not to interfere in religious affairs. It mandates the state to not promote or get involved in the affairs of the church. But the writer says that such a linear distinction is valid only for Western societies, because most Western societies are mono-religious societies where only one religion is dominant. In the case of the Western countries, it is Christianity, and hence the core principle of secularism is rooted in creating a distinction between the church and the state. But in the Indian context, where you have a diverse society with multiple religions flourishing next to each other, it is not feasible to blindly ape the principle of secularism from the Western countries. This is exactly what our constitution makers realized, and that's the reason why the likes of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar gave Indian secularism a different twist in order to make it suitable to the Indian context. So in the Indian constitution, the principle of secularism is not entirely anti-religious. It does not create a strict distinction between faith and the state. Instead, it mandates the state to respect all religions equally, and at the same time, it allows the state, the democratic institutions, and the citizenry to take a critical look at all religious practices which might be considered as non-secular and which might be seen as a threat to modern constitutional principles such as equality and liberty. So the writer says that constitutional secularism in India promotes a critical respect towards all religions, and Dr. Ambedkar personally highlighted the need to respect and at the same time critique all religions, because in a diverse society like India, it may not be possible to differentiate between religious and social practices all the time. This means that constitutional secularism in India mandates the state to not interfere directly in religious matters, and it mandates the state to respect all religions equally. But at the same time, it allows the state to intervene in religious matters if vested interests are promoting communal disharmony, or if they are promoting religious practices that are non-secular in nature, and if they are promoting religious faith and belief that can be seen as a threat to the principle of equality, liberty, freedom, etc. So on one side, constitutional secularism in India mandates the state to maintain a principled distance from all religions, but on the other hand, it abandons a strict separation between the state and religion, and it allows the state to carry out a limited intervention in religious matters in the larger interest of the constitutional democracy. It is this distinction which allows the Indian state and the Indian judiciary to interfere in certain religious matters if they are seen to be promoting caste-based or gender-based discrimination such as untouchability or personal laws which goes against women's rights, etc. But at the same time, this distinction also allows the state to subsidize religious schools, religious pilgrimage, etc. So the writer says that to prevent the weakening of this unique form of constitutional secularism, we not only need a proactive government that is committed to upholding constitutional principles such as constitutional secularism, but we also need a proactive judiciary, an alert media, and more importantly, an active civil society and an alert citizenry. The writer says that whenever constitutional secularism is seen to be under threat, and if the government is failing to live up to its constitutional responsibilities, then it falls upon the judiciary, the media, the civil society, and the citizenry to rein in such a government in order to uphold constitutional secularism. But the writer says that, of late, the rise of party political secularism is posing a threat to constitutional democracy in India. According to him, all the major political parties in India are guilty of trying to appease the fringe and radical elements in every religion. The classic example for this would be the developments surrounding the Shah Bano case and the Ayodhya dispute. In the landmark Shah Bano case, if the Congress party was guilty of trying to appease the radical factions of Islam, then the BJP is guilty of trying to appease the Hindutva faction with regard to the Ayodhya dispute. In the Shah Bano case, the Congress weakened women's rights by reversing the historic judgment of the Supreme Court. And in the Babri Masjid demolition case and the Ayodhya dispute, the BJP was guilty of promoting Hindutva elements who ended up promoting communal disharmony in the country. So these alarming developments over the last few decades might lead one to conclude that constitutional secularism in India is dying a slow death. But however, the writer argues that it is still too premature to pronounce the end of constitutional secularism because the moderates, the liberals and the intellectuals in every religion can still put up a fight with the support of the judiciary, the media, and the civil society in order to promote intra-religious reforms, which can in turn help in weakening inter-religious rivalry. He refers to the observations made by Dr. Ambedkar and Nehru, and according to them, when there is inter-religious rivalry, intra-religious reforms will come to a halt because dissent against orthodox practices in each religion gets curbed as there is unification within the religion when faced with an external threat by another religion. So if a society has to avoid this pitfall, then the moderates, the liberal factions, the judiciary, the media, the civil society and the alert citizenry, they constantly need to strive towards promoting intra-religious reforms and at the same time try and tackle inter-religious rivalry as well. The writer says that the Indian society could draw an example from Europe, which has successfully dealt with both intra-religious oppression and inter-religious conflicts. So it is on this basis that the writer says that it is still premature to conclude that constitutional secularism in India has come to an end. Because according to the writer, the Indian society is resilient to extremist radical forces, and the Indian society happens to be inherently secular and tolerant, and this gives hope for countering the threats posed to constitutional secularism. Now let's take up another column from page number 6, in which the writer evaluates India's demographic future. See, recently we had discussed a report that was published in the scientific journal Lancet. This report was based on a study conducted by the US-based Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. According to this study, India's population is all set to hit a peak by the mid of this century, that is around 2050, and at this point, India would be the most populous country in the world. Then the report predicts that by the end of this century, India's population could drop to as low as 724 million to as high as 1.09 billion. These projections indicate that India's total fertility rate or TFR shall stand at around 1.29 by the end of this century. In simple terms, total fertility rate is nothing but the average number of children that a woman has in her lifetime. India's current TFR stands at around 2.2, and India's ambition in order to stabilize its population is to bring down the TFR rate to around 2 to 2.1, which will basically help us in achieving replacement level fertility. Because at this fertility rate, every couple would be replacing themselves with 2 children, thus leading to population stabilization in the coming years. But however, if the TFR rate falls below 2, then the population is going to decline in the future, and it is this demographic change that India needs to be prepared for. See, the population projection of IHME estimates India's population to fall to around 1 billion by the end of this century, but whereas UN projections place India's population by 2050 at 1.64 billion, making India the most populous country, and until this point, the projections of the UN and the IHME are in line. But the two projections start to differ in the second half of the century, because according to the UN, by the end of this century, India's population might stand at around 1.45 billion. So there is a considerable difference in the population projection that has been brought out by both the reports. But either ways, India's policy makers need to prepare for a peak in population by the mid of this century and a substantial decline in the later half of the century. The writer argues that India's population control policies and resource allocation policies are outdated because they do not take into account the ongoing economic changes and its impact on population figures. Here, the writer provides a small history to India's efforts at population control, and she explains that between the 1970s and 1990s, India's population control policies were largely coercive in nature. During the emergency, there have been reports of forced sterilization. Then later, the government has also pushed for intrauterine device insertion as a contraceptive technique, which is again seen as a coercive way of promoting family planning. But these controversial methods helped bring down India's TFR rate from 5.9 to 4.9 by 1990s. Then after India took part in the Cairo Conference on Development in 1994 and signed onto the convention, such coercive family planning practices were brought to a halt, and instead India started adopting a carrot and stick policy in order to create a system of incentives and penalties for having more than 2 children. For example, India imposes penalties for having a third child by denying maternity leave, by denying maternity benefits, by prohibiting such couples from contesting local elections, and at the same time, it also offers financial incentives in order to promote family planning. This model of incentives and penalties has definitely helped bring down India's TFR rate, but the writer argues that this model is not in line with India's economic transition. The writer's argument is that India's economy has seen a massive transition from heavy dependency on agriculture towards exponential growth in manufacturing and especially in services. So this economic transition has automatically promoted a change in the family structure as well. Today, most couples and families prefer nuclear families as opposed to large families, because every couple and every family are trying to aspire for a better life for themselves and as well as for their children, and they can fulfill these aspirations only when the family size is smaller. So India's economic transition offers a natural incentive to adopt family planning measures, and hence the writer makes a case against such carrot and stick policies, which can also be seen as coercive in some cases. Now let's take up an article from page number 10. Indian and Afghan officials have discussed the outcome of the Loya Jirga, which was recently concluded. See, the Loya Jirga is basically a high peace council or a grand assembly that is typical to the politics of Afghanistan. See, Afghanistan is predominantly a tribal ethnic society, and traditionally in Afghanistan, senior leaders of various tribal and ethnic groups and senior political leaders have met under the grand assembly known as Loya Jirga in order to decide upon key issues. The Loya Jirga had recently met again to discuss the future of negotiations with the Taliban and as well as the release of Taliban prisoners from Afghan custody, because these terms have been mandated under the US-Taliban peace deal which was recently signed in Qatar. As per the peace deal, the US and the Taliban have agreed to bring the civil war in Afghanistan to an end based on the fulfillment of a few conditions. One condition is that the United States shall be withdrawing all its troops in the coming months, and in return, Taliban will guarantee to the United States that Afghan soil shall not be used for carrying out terror attacks, especially against American interests and Western interests. The other condition is that the Taliban is bound to engage in intra-Afghan negotiations in order to talk to the Afghan civilian government and other political leaders in Afghanistan so that a political solution could be worked out in order to resolve the conflict in the country. But as a precondition for these intra-Afghan talks to begin, all the three parties have committed to release prisoners and hostages that are held in their respective custodies. That is, the United States and the Afghan civilian government are bound to release the Taliban prisoners in their custody, and in return, the Taliban shall release all the hostages that it has captured. So just a few days ago, the Loya Jirga has been concluded, and within a few weeks, the intra-Afghan talks are all set to begin, and these developments in Afghanistan will have a direct bearing on Indian interests. Because one, India is interested in monitoring the peace process in Afghanistan, and it wants to ensure that the Afghan civilian government is given its due credit. India is still ideologically opposed to the Taliban, and it would like to keep the Taliban out of power in the Afghan government. Then apart from this, India is also concerned about the state of Indian hostages who are held in Taliban's custody, and recently a few Indian hostages have been released. But there are a few more Indian hostages in Taliban's custody, and this is the reason why India's discussion with Afghan officials acquires significance, because during these discussions, the Afghan government has briefed India on the outcomes of the Loya Jirga assembly. Now let's take up an article from page number 11. The Union Health Ministry has set up an expert committee under the chairmanship of V.K. Paul, who happens to be a member of the Niti Aayog, in order to work out the logistics and ethical aspects of vaccine procurement and vaccine administration if a successful vaccine for COVID-19 is developed. See, currently the world is racing towards the development of a vaccine for fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. A number of vaccine candidates around the world have entered into advanced stage of clinical trials, and just yesterday, Russia has gone on to claim that it has already approved the first vaccine against COVID-19. So if a successful vaccine is indeed developed, then the Indian government needs to have a strategy in place, first in order to work out the logistics that are needed in order to procure the vaccine, And second, to determine the ethical aspects based on which the vaccine shall be administered. See, ideally, such a vaccine, if available, shall be administered to the high-risk group, which consists of frontline workers such as doctors, nurses, sanitation workers, police forces, etc., and as well as to the most vulnerable segment, that is the elderly population and those patients suffering from comorbid conditions. But to enable India procure billions of doses of such a vaccine and ensure its effective distribution, and also to establish its ethical administration to priority groups, India needs a strategy to be put in place, and for this purpose, the Health Ministry has constituted an expert committee chaired by V.K. Paul. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. The term Sputnik 5, recently seen in news, refers to a vaccine developed by Russia that has been approved for usage against COVID-19. Option B is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have two related articles on page number 1 and page number 14. As we discussed, Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed that Russia has successfully developed a vaccine against COVID-19, and after going through 2 phases of trials, the vaccine has been approved for commercial usage. The Russian president has even went on to claim that his own daughter has already been inoculated with the vaccine, thereby proving the safety and the efficacy of the drug. But however, experts, especially from the Western world, are questioning these claims because this vaccine has been approved without having undergone phase 3 trials, wherein thousands of candidates should have been tested for the safety and the efficacy of the vaccine. Now let's take up the next question. Which country has offered artificial intelligence based technologies to India to help tackle COVID-19? The correct answer is option C, Israel. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 3, Israel has already provided AI based technologies to Indian institutions to help tackle COVID-19. Now let's take up the next question. What are smog towers that are often seen in news? The correct answer is option B. They are structures designed as large-scale air purifiers to reduce air pollution and particulate matter in order to tackle smog formation. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 3, the Delhi government has signed an agreement with IIT Bombay in order to install smog towers in the heavily populated areas of Delhi as mandated by the Supreme Court. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The HTT-40 is an advanced 5th generation fighter jet being indigenously developed in India. The HTT-40 is being built by HAL or the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited for the Indian Air Force. The Defence Acquisition Council has approved the procurement of 106 HTT-40 aircraft for the IAF. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option D is the right answer. See, HTT-40 is not a 5th generation fighter jet. It is a basic trainer aircraft that has been indigenously developed by the HAL for the Indian Air Force. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, the Defence Acquisition Council has approved the procurement of 106 HTT-40 aircrafts for the Indian Air Force. Now let's take up the next question. Rahat Indori, who passed away recently, was a noted Urdu poet. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because this article on page number 11 refers to the recent passing away of Rahat Indori, who was a noted Urdu poet known for his contribution in keeping the Mushaira form of poetry alive. Now let's take up a question from the 2015 prelims paper. With reference to inflation in India, which of the following statements is correct? Controlling inflation in India is the responsibility of the Government of India only. This statement is incorrect. The Reserve Bank of India has no role in controlling inflation. This statement is also incorrect because controlling inflation is the primary responsibility of the RBI. Decreased money circulation helps in controlling inflation. Yes, this statement is correct, so option C is the right answer. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, it is premature to pronounce the end of constitutional secularism in India. Discuss. The second question, illustrate the demographic changes that India is going to witness in the future along with its impact. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.